The best Christmas present in the world. I spotted it in a junk shop in Bridport, a roll-top desk. The man said it was early 19th century and oak. I had wanted one, but they were far too expensive. This one was in a bad condition. The roll-top in several pieces, one leg clumsily mended, scotch marks all down one side. It was going for very little money. I thought I could restore it. It would be a risk, a challenge, but I had to have it. I paid the man and brought it back to my workroom at the back of the garage. I began to work on it on Christmas Eve. This para is about the roll-top desk. The author found a roll-top desk in a junk shop. It was in a bad condition but cheap. He thought that he could restore it, so he bought it. He began to work on it on Christmas Eve. I removed the roll-top completely and pulled out the drawers. The veneer had lifted almost everywhere. It looked like water damage to me. Both fire and water had clearly taken their toll on this desk. The last drawer was stuck fast. I tried all I could to ease it out gently. In the end, I used brute force. I struck it sharply with the side of my fist and the drawer flew open to reveal a shallow space underneath, a secret drawer. There was something in there. I reached in and took out a small black tin box. Sellotape to the top of it was a piece of lined notepaper and written on it in a shaky handwriting. Jim's last letter received January 25, 1915. Here, in this para, the author pulled out the drawers. He found that these had been badly damaged by fire and water. The man who sold it had told him that it was very old. The last drawer had stuck fast. He had used much force to open it. When he opened it, it revealed a secret place. In it, he found a small tin box. On the top of the box, these words were written. Jim's last letter received January 25, 1915. To be buried with me when the time comes. I knew, as I did it, that it was wrong of me to open the box. But curiosity got the better of my scruples. It usually does. Inside the box, there was an envelope. The address read, Mrs. Jim MacPherson, 12 Copper Beeches, Bridport, Dorset. I took out the letter and unfolded it. It was written in pencil and dated at the top, December 26, 1914. Dearest Coney, I write to you in a much happier frame of mind because something wonderful has just happened that I must tell you about at once. We were all standing in our trenches yesterday morning, Christmas morning. It was crisp and quiet all about, as beautiful a morning as I've ever seen, as cold and frosty as a Christmas morning should be. Here it was written as, to be buried with me when the time comes. Inside there was an envelope with the address, Mrs. Jim MacPherson, 12 Copper Beeches, Bridport. The date was December 26, 1914. The author read the letter. The owner of the desk must have put it in. The letter had been written by the captain of the English army. His name was Jim MacPherson. He had written it to his wife Coney. A wonderful incident had happened on the battlefield on the Christmas day. Jim MacPherson had narrated it in this letter. I should like to be able to tell you that we began it, but the truth, I am ashamed to say, is that Fritz began it. First, someone saw a white flag waving from the trenches opposite. Then, they were calling out to us from across no man's land, Happy Christmas, Tommy! Happy Christmas! When we had got over the surprise, some of us shouted back, Same to you, Fritz, same to you. I thought that would be that. We all did. But then suddenly, one of them was up there in his grey greatcoat and waving a white flag. Don't shoot, lads, someone shouted. And no one did. Then there was another Fritz up on the parapet and another. Keep your heads down, I told the men. It's a trick. But it wasn't. The English and the Germans were at war. The two armies stood in their respective trenches on the two sides of the no man's land. Suddenly, MacPherson saw someone waving a white flag from the enemy side. Then he saw many German soldiers calling out to them. They were wishing a happy Christmas to the English soldiers. Some English soldiers shouted back, Same to you. The English thought that was all. To their surprise, they saw many Germans moving towards them. The captain was alarmed. It could be a trick, but it was not. One of the Germans was waving a bottle above his head. It's Christmas Day, Tommy. We have schnapps, We have sausage. We meet you. Yes. By this time, there were dozens of them walking towards us across no man's land, and not a rifle between them. Little Private Morris was the first up. Come on, boys. What are we waiting for? And then there was no stopping them. I was the officer. I should have stopped them there and then, I suppose. But the truth is that it never even occurred to me I should. All along their line and ours, I could see men walking slowly towards one another, grey coats, khaki coats meeting in the middle. And I was one of them. I was part of this. In the middle of the war, we were making peace. Here, they were bringing with them German wine and canned meat. Now there were no rifles between the soldiers. They were hugging one another. You cannot imagine, dearest Coney, my feelings as I looked into the eyes of the Fritz officer who approached me, hand outstretched. Hans Ulf, he said, gripping my hand warmly and holding it. I am from Dusseldorf. I play the cello in the orchestra. Happy Christmas. Captain Jim Macpherson, I replied, and a happy Christmas to you. I am a school teacher from Dorset in the west of England. The German officer moved towards Macpherson. They shook hands very warmly. Then the German officer said that he was from Dusseldorf and that he played cello in the orchestra. He gave his name as Hans Wolf. In return, Macpherson also introduced himself. He said that he was a school teacher from Dorset in England. Ah, Dorset, he smiled. I know this place. I know it very well. We shared my rum ration and his excellent sausage. And we talked. Coney, how we talked. He spoke almost perfect English. But it turned out that he had never set foot in Dorset, never even been to England. He had learned all he knew of England from school and from reading books in English. His favorite writer was Thomas Hardy, his favorite book, Far from the Madding Crowd. So out there in no man's land, we talked of Bathsheba and Gabriel Oak and Sergeant Roy and Dorset. He had a wife and one son, born just 6 months ago. As I looked about me, there were hurdles of khaki and grey everywhere, all over no man's land, smoking, laughing, talking, drinking, eating. Hans Wolf and I shared what was left of your wonderful Christmas cake, Coney. Here Hans Wolf smiled. He said he knew Dorset. In fact, he had never been to England, but he knew English. His favorite writer was Thomas Hardy. His favorite book was Far from the Madding Crowd. It was from there he had learnt all about Dorset. Macpherson shared with Hans Wolf the Christmas cake his wife had sent for him. He thought the marzipan was the best he had ever tasted. I agreed. We agreed about everything, and he was my enemy. There never was a Christmas party like it, Coney. Then someone I don't know who bought out a football. Grey coats were dumped in piles to make goalposts, and the next thing we knew it was Tommy against Fritz out in the middle of no man's land. Hans Wolf and I looked on and cheered, clapping our hands and stamping our feet to keep out the cold as much as anything. There was a moment when I noticed our breaths mingling in the air between us. He saw it too and smiled. Jim Macpherson, he said after a while, I think this is how we should resolve this war. A football match. No one dies in a football match. No children are orphaned. No wives become widow. Then a soldier brought out a football. The soldiers played while Macpherson and Hans Wolf clapped and cheered. Hans Wolf suggested that the world would have been better if the problems were resolved by football match instead of war. No one dies in a football match, and no children are orphaned, and no wife become widow. I would prefer cricket, I told him. Then we Tommies could be sure of winning probably. We laughed at that, and together we watched the game. Sad to say, Coney, Fritz won, 2-1. But as Ansel generously said, our goals were wider than theirs, so it wasn't quite fair. The time came, and all too soon. When the game was finished, the schnapps and the rum and the sausage had long since run out, and we knew it was all over. I wished Hans well and told him I hoped he would see his family again soon, that the fighting would end and we could all go home. Macpherson preferred cricket and said that if it was cricket, Tommies would have won. Fritz won with 2 goals. Fritz generously said that their goalpost was wider and that the victory wasn't quite fair. After the football match, all the drinks and eatables were consumed. Now it was time to part. Hanswolf saluted Macpherson and walked away slowly and unwillingly. I think that is what every soldier wants, on both sides, Hanswolf said. Take care, Jim Macpherson. I shall never forget this moment, nor you. He saluted and walked away from me slowly, unwillingly, I felt. He turned to wave just once and then became one of the hundreds of grey-coated men drifting back towards the trenches. That night, back in our dugouts, we heard them singing a carol, and singing it quite beautifully. It was Stilly Natch, Silent Night. Our boys gave them a rousing chorus of Wild Shepherds Watched. We exchanged carols for a while, and then we all fell silent. We had had a time of peace and goodwill, a time I will treasure as long as I live. That night, the Germans were heard singing a carol. The English soldiers replied with a rousing chorus of another carol. They exchanged carols for a while, and then it was all silence. Macpherson wrote in his letter that he would treasure those moments all his life. Dearest Coney, by Christmas time next year, this war will be nothing but a distant and terrible memory. I know from all that happened today how much both armies long for peace. We shall be together again soon. I am sure of it. Your loving Jim. I folded the letter again and slipped it carefully back into its envelope. I kept awake all night. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I drove into Bridport, just a few miles away. I asked a boy walking his dog where Copper Beaches was. House number 12 turned out to be nothing but a burnt-out shell, the roof gapping, the windows boarded up. I knocked at the doors next door and asked if anyone knew the whereabouts of Mrs. Macpherson. Macpherson ended the letter hoping that the war would end soon. Both armies longed for peace and he was sure that they would meet again. Having read the letter, the author put it back into the envelope. He decided to give the letter back to whom it belonged. The address was Bridport, Dorset, so he drove to the place. The house number 12 turned out to be a burnt-out shell. It was found that Mrs. Macpherson was in the house when it caught fire. The fireman had got her out just in time. She was 101 years old. Now she was in nursing home. Oh yes, said the old man in his slippers. He knew her well. A lovely old lady, he told me. A bit muddle-headed, but at her age she was entitled to be, wasn't she? 101-year-old. She had been in the house when caught fire. No one really knew how the fire had started, but it could well have been candles. She used candles rather than electricity because she always thought electricity was too expensive. The fireman had got her out just in time. She was in a nursing home now, he told me. Burlington House on Dorchester Road on the other side of the town. The old man said that the lady who lived nearby was muddle-headed. That means she was in a confused state. She was 101 years and the house caught fire and no one really knew how the fire started. But all knew that the old lady used candles instead of electricity as she felt that electricity was too expensive. During this incident, a fireman got her out of the fire and now she is in the nursing home in Burlington House on the Dorchester on the other side of the town. I found Burlington House nursing home easily enough. There were paper chains up in the hallway and a lighted Christmas tree stood in the corner with a lopsided angel on top. I said I was a friend come to visit Mrs. Macpherson to bring her a Christmas present. I could see through into the dining room where everyone were wearing a paper hat and singing. The matron had a hat on too and seemed happy enough to see me. She even offered me a mince pie. She walked me along the corridor. Mrs. Macpherson is not in with the others, she told me. She's rather confused today, so we thought it best if she had a good rest. She has no family, you know. No one visits, so I'm sure she'll be only too pleased to see you. She took me into a conservatory with wicker chairs and potted plants all around and left me. Here, the author went to the nursing home. He met the matron. She told the author that Mrs. Macpherson was rather confused that day. They put her in a conservatory and she was sitting there alone. The old lady was sitting in a wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. She had silver white hair pinned into a wispy bun. She was gazing out at the garden. "Hello," I said. She turned and looked up at me vacantly. "Happy Christmas, Coney," I went on. "I found this. I think it's yours." As I was speaking, her eyes never left my face. I opened the tin box and gave it to her. That was the moment her eyes lit up with recognition and her face became suffused with a sudden glow of happiness. I explained about the desk, about how I had found it, but I don't think she was listening. For a while, she said nothing but stroked the letter tenderly with her fingertips. The author found Mrs. Macpherson sitting in a chair. Naturally, she looked up at the author vacantly, but her eyes lit up when he called her Coney and gave her the letter. He told her how he got the letter, but she was not listening to him. She reached out and took his hand. Suddenly, she reached out and took my hand. Her eyes was filled with tears. "You told me you would come home by Christmas, dearest," she said. "And here you are, the best Christmas present in the world. Come closer, Jim dear. Sit down." I sat down beside her and she kissed my cheek. "I read your letters so often, Jim, every day. I wanted to hear your voice in my head. It always made me feel you were with me. And now you are. Now you're back. You can read it to me yourself. Would you do that for me, Jim dear? I just want to hear your voice again." "I would love that so much. And then perhaps we'll have some tea. I've made you a nice Christmas cake, marzipan all around. I know how much you love marzipan." Here the lady's eyes was filled with tears. She felt that her Jim had returned. She said that her Jim had kept his promise. He had returned on the Christmas Eve. She made him sit beside her. She kissed him on his cheek. She talked long and loving to him. She said that she had got the best Christmas present in the world.